Welcome to the Vermont Vegetable and Berry webinar series. Today, Becky Maden and myself, Laura Johnson, are going to be talking about fall cover crop options. So when we talk about cover crops and cover cropping, we're really just thinking about any intentionally planted crop to cover bare soil that is not a cash crop. And there's four main categories of cover crops: grasses, legumes, and non-grass or legumes such as brassicas, and then a mix of any of those types of plants. And we know that cover crops can help us meet important soil management goals in our landscapes, and I've got some of those listed here. Protecting soil from erosion and runoff, adding active organic matter to soil, and scavenging soil nitrogen are all things that grasses, for example, might be really good at doing. Fixing nitrogen, which is only done by legumes, and then breaking hardpan and weed and pest control are other goals we might have on our farm, and brassicas and are exceptional at helping with those soil management goals. And then generally improving soil livestock diversity, and with the diversity of crops and cover crops, and improving soil aggregate stability are other benefits to cover cropping. So all types of cover crops, no matter their species, will contribute to in some way or another to these goals. But some perform better than others depending on what you're hoping to do. So I'd like to talk about fall cover crops using these three categories and their seasons of growth. So summer annuals, winter annuals, and perennials. And today we're going to be focusing on crops that you could start planting today up until or through October of this year. So that's the time frame that we're using when thinking about fall cover crop options. And I would like to go through just some examples of some of those that you might consider to plant now or in a few weeks or a month from now. And I'm going to start with those summer annuals. And there's quite a spectrum of the summer annual category, and some of which are plants that you might choose to use earlier in the season, like buckwheat. But planting buckwheat right now is probably not the best option. There's other potential summer annuals that you could use that might be more beneficial. So something like oats and peas would do better this time of year. And I know a lot of you are already using that cover crop for your field. So, and the summer annuals that would be planted for early fall, which generally the dates of early fall fall within August 15th and September 15th. So we're kind of right in the middle of that timeline. And it does vary depending on where you are in the state. But that's kind of the general parameter of dates around the plantings for these early fall crops. And they will winter kill. So these are crops that will leave residue to cover your soils over the winter. And so they provide organic matter and weed suppression in the spring, and they don't resume growth in the spring. And then while they're growing in the fall or early fall, you can expect to see or experience some nitrogen scavenging to some degree, and then also some nitrogen fixation to some degree. So this is just an example photo of a farm that had seeded down oats in their fields, and you can see the soil cover that it provided over the winter and into the spring, and the weed suppression. You do see some weeds coming through here, but it is keeping a lot of those at bay as well. So this picture was taken in mid-May in the springtime. So this is another example of oats while they're growing in the fall, early fall, planted with peas. And oats in this case are serving more of a purpose of being a nurse crop, but they do provide that above and below ground biomass that is so important for our soils. And those peas are helping to, or are fixing nitrogen in our soils for us too for free. This is another spring photo of brassica cover crop that was planted the fall before, early fall before. This is a dead forage radish. You can see in the middle of the screen the remains of that radish, and then just above it to the right, a small hole that it was pulled from. So these tap roots can help break hardpan, and then those holes leave great areas for water infiltration, which could potentially mean drier fields sooner in the spring. And if you expect to get this kind of growth on any forage radishes in your field, it's always helpful to plant a little sooner in the in those planting dates in order to get to accumulate that growth. And then as you get later in the season, of course, it won't grow as much, but still does benefit our soils. And I feel like, you know, something is better than nothing. So that's another option that you can choose. And then mustard. So mustard is a popular cover crop that is used as a biofumigant and does help combat root knot nematode and soil-borne fungal pathogens, and as well as having some allelopathic effects against weeds. So there is still time to plant that this season so far as well. Now I'm going to move on to winter annuals and perennials, which are winter hardy. So these plants will not winter kill necessarily, and they will begin growth in the fall and then resume growth in the spring. Some of the examples that I'm going to go through are particularly the legume crops are plants that you could also choose to seed in the spring. Red clover in particular does really well as a frost seeded crop, cover crop. So the time frame that we'll be thinking about as we talk about these winter annuals and perennials is this early fall time frame between August 15th and September 15th. And that includes the legumes, brassicas, and grasses that we'll go through. And then the fall and later fall timeline really just applies to a lot of the grasses that we'll touch on. So the winter annuals and perennials provide soil protection and nitrogen scavenging, and if you're choosing to use a crop that might be in a field that will be left out of cash crop for a year or even more, it could provide cover for multiple years and nitrogen fixation in that time period as well. So this is an example of a field that was seeded down with winter rye. And winter rye is a really great go-to if you've got late harvested vegetables, or if you kind of aren't really sure what to put in your fields. You can go to winter rye, and it's probably going to grow and do pretty well. It's a pretty hardy grass crop that you can use as a cover crop. This picture that we see here was a planting that was done on September 15th, and the picture was taken about 2 months later. So you can kind of get a sense of the amount of growth that occurred in that time frame in this particular example. Of course, you're all very familiar with the variables that can influence that, but just as an example, we can look at it here. And in winter rye is while it's a great crop to use, it can also get away from you in the springtime if you are, if you don't have a plan to terminate it. So that's another consideration to think about before choosing your cover crop or your cover crop mix. And that's how will you terminate that crop in the spring, or is it going to terminate over the winter like we talked about with the summer annuals? And Becky's going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. And Winter Rye is great at outcompeting weeds, and it does also have allelopathic effects on them as well. This field was also broadcast seeded and then lightly disked in. I wrote a small list of other potential grasses that you might choose to use as a cover crop. Winter wheat is another go-to. I know a lot of farms, if they can't get winter rye seed for whatever reason, winter wheat is kind of their next go-to option. It is it's not as aggressive in the spring, so a lot of folks also prefer it for that reason as well. You can't generally plant it as late as winter rye, but it's still pretty winter hardy. Triticale is another option, which is a wheat rye hybrid, and then annual and perennial rye are great options, and they have particularly dense root systems that are great for outcompeting weeds in the spring. So those two final options, though, are not great at germinating in drier conditions. So if you're in the part of the state, which is most of it this year, that's been in drought conditions, then that's just a consideration to think about if you choose to use something like annual and perennial rye. Moving on to a legume crop that overwinters, and that is hairy vetch, which is a great nitrogen contributor. Becky's going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of how much nitrogen different cover crops might contribute to your soils. And there's a great picture of the nodulation on the root system of hairy vetch here on the right. But it's another one that you probably want to plant with a nurse crop, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But and it's best if terminated in later May to really maximize that nitrogen contribution to your soil. And it can be a little messy. So this is an example of another legume crop mixed with a perennial grass stand, and this is that red clover, which does really well if you decide to frost seed it in the spring, if you don't get it in soon enough in the fall, early fall. Although if you are on really sandy soils, it doesn't do as well frost seeding in those conditions. So just keeping that in mind. But another great nitrogen contributor. This is another mixed stand of both winter killed crops and winter hardy crops. So we've got a winter wheat mixed with mustard and radish. This photo was taken mid-September, and then, or sorry, it was planted mid-September, and then the photo was taken about a little over a month later. So just as an example of the amount of biomass that you might see in that sort of time frame, depending on when you're able to get your seed in the ground and when your harvest is out of the way. And that winter wheat's a great catch crop, good erosion control, and then the mixes are great for building organic matter and soil tilth. So just an example of those two types of crops, or those three types of crops. And also I did revisit this field in the spring, and some of the mustard and radish did actually overwinter, but not to any significant amount, I'd say. But it was interesting to see that the growth did resume in the spring. And that may have been because of the microclimate, or maybe it just didn't, it wasn't a hard winter. So, but generally those will winter kill. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about the integration of perennial crops in your vegetable cropping system, and think about, interplanting or undersowing perennial crops as a way to contribute to your rotations, and also take advantage of covering bare soil with a cover crop. And strip cropping or undersowing is just when you've got strips of legumes or grass or a mix of those two between your cash crop. And it's a great option for later harvested vegetable crops. Generally you would just mow them as needed to manage their growth. So they are really great at bearing equipment traffic, depending on the crop too. Some are excel at this. They also allow for you planting on more sloping ground. And if you establish a perennial or strip crop, it can also kind of reduce the urgency to plant a fall or late fall cover crop if you've already got something established, at least in strips, because it's going to help hold the soil in place and hold nutrients in place if they're already established, even if it's not the whole field that's uniformly cover cropped. But like with any cover cropping, there's always extra seed expense, and particularly with strip cropping or undersowing, the consideration of whether or not you might need special equipment to make it a successful planting. And it also works better with some vegetables than others. So intercropping is, great with corn or squash, whereas carrots and onions are not really the top candidates for this sort of practice. So this is just an example. We've got, I think, 6-foot alleyways of white clover between plastic mulch squash. And white clover is really durable, and it works really well at withstanding that equipment impact throughout the season. And then it's there and already established for the winter. This was a November photo. Another example of a strip crop, we've got oats between strawberries in this photo. An example of some specialized equipment that can be used for strip cropping. This is Winter Rye in the spring, and they're tilling in those strips where something like a squash could be planted. Here that you can see the rye has been crimped. So another consideration that, how would you crimp that rye if this was something that you'd want to experiment with, and do you need some specialized equipment for that? But just a great option for having a living mulch or some mulch in place that is terminated. And then here's a really great successful example of a late harvest vegetable, as kale here, with some perennial grass in between each row. And I like to use, this picture is great to compare to the next one I'm about to show you, which is kind of a poor example in how it can come out if you neglect to plant appropriately in terms of seed to soil contact and the sort of equipment you may utilize when seeding down between strips of cash crops. So I believe in this prior photo, they did a final cultivation between the kale and then were able to seed down that perennial grass and run over it, which allowed it to establish really well between that kale. And then in this picture, this is actually corn silage, but the farm has a really difficult time getting their crop off before before the middle of October, and so they haven't had a lot of success planting winter cover crops, just because it's so late in the season. This is up in the Northeast Kingdom, so their season is even shorter than some other parts of the state. But so they decided they'd experiment with broadcasting winter wheat at side dress time so that it would establish, and then once canopy closure occurred in the corn, it would uh, stop growing some and then resume growth after that corn was removed. But you can see here that on the right, there is somewhat of an establishment of that winter wheat, but it's not super dense, and it is, in this case, probably pretty vulnerable to damage when equipment goes through there to harvest that corn. And then in a neighboring field, you can see after the silage was chopped that that wheat is not terribly uniformly established along this field. And a lot of that has to do with that lack of seed to soil contact when they broadcast it on at side dress time. So you can even see a line, tire line here, where piece of equipment must have run over the seed, and you can see how much better that establishment is with that, with when that happened or after that happened. So and then if we're thinking about using a grass legume mix as a cover crop, whether it's winter hardy or will winter kill, I think it's interesting to think about, why are we using a nurse crop? Why not just plant straight peas or straight vetch? And there's a lot of reasons and advantages to planting that combination. And on this slide, I've compared nurse crops to companion crops, and companion crops are really a mixed crop that will grow together, but they don't necessarily depend on one another. So each are independently growing and probably could do just as well if it was there on its own. Whereas nurse crops, which are usually the grasses in like a grass legume mix, are helping to support that legume in growth and also protect it in many occasions. So it provides that physical structure for the legume to grow up, and can minimize tangling and matting, especially with something like hairy vetch. The nurse crop provides protection for young seedlings and also can help reduce the heaving of a root system in that freeze-thaw cycle that occurs throughout our winter. So it can also help balance out the carbon to nitrogen ratio, which we will touch on a little bit more later in this talk. And that nurse crop, that grass, also mops excess nitrogen and other nutrients that may be left behind in the field after your cash crop. So if you're thinking about planting one of those combinations of nurse crop and legume, I know that right now we're kind of in this midway window of planting oats and peas, and I just really liked this publication that I found from Cornell that was talking about the amount of biomass put on by this particular combination of a really popularly used cover crop, and how that biomass production changes over time, and as time moves on, that your biomass production is going to be less. But it looks particularly at how the growth changes over time across the oats and the peas. So here we've got on the y-axis of this image the above ground biomass in pounds per acre, and then the date of seeding across the bottom on the x-axis. So you can see the field peas in blue, oats in red, that at the beginning of the month of August, which we've already passed, you can see that field peas were doing really well. And then as we move on into August, the oats start to outcompete the peas in terms of growth. So, and then, so just thinking about like knowing this and thinking about what your goals are in your fields, and if it is to fix nitrogen, maybe the oat pea mix is something to do the next year, and moving to something like a rye vetch that will overwinter and continue to resume growth in the spring, um, and produce nitrogen for your soil, and also more biomass. So I just thought that was really interesting to note. And then also remembering that varieties also matter. So like thinking about the difference between a grain type field pea and a forage type pea, and the amount of biomass or growth that each of those varieties will put on, where the forage pea is much better for green manure crop as opposed to the grain pea, which is lower growing and does not produce as much green matter. And then again, if you're choosing to use a legume, which is a great option for cover cropping, remember to inoculate. So unless you've used that same legume in the past 2 or 3 years, you probably need to reintroduce the bacteria that promotes that root nodulation and fixing of atmospheric nitrogen that is then transformed to ammonium nitrogen in your soils. So if you're using a clover inoculant for pea or vetch, that won't be successful. So it's important to make sure that you're matching your inoculant with the type of legume that you are seeding down. And wherever you're buying your seeds from, they should also be able to provide you with that inoculant. And it's relatively inexpensive, and it is also important to make sure you check the expiration, buy it before it's expired, and use it before it expires, because that bacterial inoculant does not have a very long shelf life. Okay, and I think that, whoops, one more slide here on just more on inoculants and how you inoculate your seeds. So if you can also, I didn't mention this before, but you can buy seed that is pre-inoculated, but I think it's a little bit better insurance if you are inoculating your seed yourself, in terms of the viability of that bacteria. And when you're doing that, when you're inoculating your seeds yourself, you can just, put the seed and the inoculant in a bucket, and maybe a little bit of milk or Coca-Cola or something that's going to stick those two substances together. Thoroughly mix it, and then if it's starting to clump, spread it out, maybe let it dry a little bit, break up those clumps, and then go ahead and seed, ideally that same day. So I'm going to pass off the presentation to Becky here.
Great, thanks, Laura.
This conference will now
Great,
be
so
recorded.
thank you. Great, thanks, Laura, for laying out a ton of information on cover crops. I'm going to build on that by just talking about some of the practical field information about seeding, crop rotations, termination, and then finally touching on some details of nitrogen fixation. So Laura talked a lot about the kind of the biology of cover crops and options, but on a practical level, we know, especially here in Vermont and in the Northeast, that we're a little limited in terms of our planting windows, and incorporating that, that's a bad word, incorporating, but integrating that into a cash crop rotation is tricky. So I sort of break it down into two broad categories. One is this first one of thinking ahead to what's going to go into that piece of land for early spring planting. So if I have a piece of open land right now and it's been relatively weed free, low weed pressure, and I think it would be a good candidate for a very early season crop like spinach, peas, early seeded carrots or beets or greens, then I might think about a cover crop that's going to winter kill, or a cover crop that I'm willing to incorporate quite early, so a young rye crop. And those would be seeded in the next couple of weeks. It's August, 26th right now. I'd say by mid-August you're thinking about getting, or sorry, mid-September, you're getting those cover crops in. And those would be followed in the spring by these early crops. So you don't have to do a lot of tillage to get these crops in. And then you have this opportunity in the summer next year to either do a really robust summer cover crop and put on some biomass, or bare fallow it, flush out any weeds that are left, and get on a really nice early fall cover crop. So ideally, we all have crop rotations that are planned out for like 3 years, 5 years, and you would, know ahead of time what you're doing. But that's probably not the case, and things change based on like what weather patterns you're seeing, what fields are going to be dry in the spring, what your weed seed bank is like given this season. So things change, but just to think as we're making cover crop decisions, what's going to go in next year is really critical. So here's an example of rye that might be turned in really easy, and you can usually do this without plowing, without a lot of heavy tillage. You just need to flip it somehow with a disc, or even sometimes a field cultivator is enough to chew this up. And then here's winter killed peas and oats. So as Laura said, these, especially if you're doing peas and oats, you want to get those in mid to late August in Vermont. Once you're getting into September, I would suggest probably just going with straight oats, as she showed on that chart earlier. The shift in biomass begins to take place, where the oats are gonna be outcompeting the peas anyway, and peas are a little more expensive for seed, so you probably want to skip it once you get into September 1st and onward. So the other big category is the one you might be more familiar with, which is, you've got your late season vegetables, you're still harvesting right through October, and you're kind of limited in your choices, right? A lot of us lean heavily on winter rye. That's not a bad thing. If you can get things in a little earlier, you can consider vetch. So kind of through mid to late September is a seeding window for vetch. Once you get into October, probably not worth spending the money. But the real trick is thinking about what's going in the summer. If you're going to incorporate those cover crops early in the spring, the vetch is not worth your money. It's an expensive seed. I would say skip it and just go with straight rye. If you can wait and hang on till mid to late May to incorporate it, you're going to have a really healthy legume, tons of nitrogen. It'll be beautiful, and you can really capture some free fertilizer basically from that cover crop and put in your summer vegetables. So I tend to think of like your second succession of cucurbits, your field tomatoes, your field eggplant, peppers, maybe corn, melons. Those warm loving crops, even sweet potatoes, can follow a vetch rye cover crop. And as I said earlier, if you're not going to be able to wait that long, I would save the money on the vetch seed. It's just not worth it. And again, this can kind of dictate where you're headed after that in terms of thinking ahead to, next winter, the winter of 2021 or onwards. You're probably pulling that summer crop out later in the fall. So you could do, again, rye, vetch. And you can really build a pretty powerful farm crop rotation just around these cover cropping windows. I think it's a kind of flipping it on its head to think about the cover crops driving the cash crop rotations, but it's I think a pretty compelling way to think about it. And you can manage your seeds, your weed seed bank, your fertility, your diseases pretty effectively by thinking about cover crops. So here's some examples of that. This is a later spring, pretty mature rye and vetch. It looks to me like this farmer has been chipping away at this through the course of the spring. So it's a pretty common scenario that you have a big field and you're going to take out kind of 2 or 3 beds at a time and start incorporating them and giving it time to break down. On some of these slides, I've noted the carbon to nitrogen ratio. It's pretty intuitive. The younger and lusher and greener the cover crop is, the less the less nitrogen tie-up you're going to see. As the carbon to nitrogen ratio increases, that nitrogen will be tied up for a little bit of time. So you want to give yourself a longer window between incorporating the cover crop and planting your cash crop as that carbon to nitrogen ratio increases. And it's, again, pretty intuitive. The woodier or more lignin-y the cover crop is, or the more mature it is, the longer you're going to have to leave. And you can tell by, you see these pieces of residue there in the soil. Those are going to take a little bit of time to break down, and the microbes, as they eat the more carbony material, they are consuming nitrogen and tying it up. And then when they die, when they've eaten everything and they die, that's when you get this burst of nitrogen. That's a really simplistic and unscientific way of explaining that, but that's the way I think of it. And here's an even more mature rye stand. Something I like about this photo too is you can really, I think cover crops are a good indicator of overall field fertility. So when I see paler, kind of less robust cover crop, I tend to think that's like a weaker fertility area, either less residual fertility from the year before, or you have more leaching, or it's more saturated. Whatever's going on, you can kind of see the waves in that field, which I find to be interesting. And finally, this is like the farther end of the spectrum. This is a cover crop that we were harvesting for seed, for rye seed. If you have access to a combine, this is a really awesome and fun way to work with cover crops. You can harvest a lot of seed and save money this way and get a pretty high quality seed. And then you can use the straw for a mulch. But this is like the most kind of highest carbon to nitrogen ratio you're gonna get. So you'd wanna, like, if you've let your rye go too long, you probably want to flail mow this if you're not going to harvest it for the seed, and give yourself like 3 to 4 weeks before you try to get a cash crop in there. It's going to take a long time before you have any nitrogen available for your crop, even if you're fertilizing. Some termination strategies. Another thing to consider when choosing a cover crop or choosing the timing of planting is what equipment you have available and how much tolerance you have for managing cover crops. One thing people do, which is if you have access to extra land and the haying equipment, is to bale your rye for straw. If you've got a clean field and you can let it get relatively mature, like not quite into mature seed, but you know, just at antithis, I think is the word, when it's just starting to get pollinated, you want to mow it, you can bale it, and have some awesome clean mulch from your own farm. You're transporting the biomass and the nutrients, but you're leaving it all on your farm. So that's pretty cool. You can also use a hay mower just to mow it down and turn it in. So this is rye that's only probably 8 to 10 inches tall. So a relatively shallow flip is a very effective and quick way to terminate this cover crop. You won't see much of it rebounding. And I know we're all kind of anti-moldboard plowing, but I think a shallow plow means you're making less passes over the field. So rather than disking it or tilling it multiple times, you're just flipping it once, letting it hang out for a couple weeks, and then you can get the field ready for planting. So I don't throw the moldboard plow out the window completely, and I think it's great for this type of cover crop use. Flail mowers are one of my favorite tools when it comes to cover crops. They really accelerate your window of time in terms of terminating to planting. So you can see how fine that mulch is coming off of there. That's some pretty juicy material, and that can be incorporated into the soil pretty quickly. It also permits the strategy of cut and carry. So I've seen more and more farmers using this. It's pretty labor intensive, but you're growing your own mulch, and there's a lot of nitrogen. In the previous picture, that was peas and oats getting mowed down, tons of nitrogen in that. This looks just like a straight grass, but there will be some nitrogen gain from the leaching, I think, into the field. But more importantly, you're creating your own mulch so you know where it's coming from, and suppressing weeds and retaining moisture and all those other nice benefits. So I think that's a pretty cool system if you have the labor, and a fun little cushion to jump into on a moment of boredom on your farm. Another thing we've seen for reducing tillage, this is a pretty sandy farm down in Fairleigh, and they do, in some scenarios, they will do a quick incorporation of cover crops and then tarp it to complete the breakdown. So they're reducing their tillage passes. They're using the tarp to also eliminate any weeds that might be germinating during that time window. And there's a lot of labor and muscle in moving those giant tarps around, but you know, it's they're just shifting their labor into a different activity. So I think they've had some good success with using this for cover crop termination or breakdown. Laura and I both liked this chart as kind of a consolidated explanation of what we were just discussing in terms of selecting a cover crop, thinking about biomass, winter kill, how are you going to manage it. So this is broken down into On the top hemisphere of this, you've got winter hardy. On the bottom hemisphere, you've got winter killed. Left, you have low residue, right, high residue. So in the category of the blue there, low residue, winter hardy, really the only thing I think about that we would be using as vegetable farmers there is clovers. And clovers are often useful to throw into a mix, like a summer mix of sorghum, Sudan grass, millet, oats, peas, whatever you have on hand, you can toss in a mix, throw on the summer, see what does the best, and then you can mow it off and let the clover, medium red clover is a great candidate, take over, and you'll get a really nice stand of clover. You can overwinter, you can take a field out of production for an entire season with this system, but the clover can be hard to terminate, especially in the spring. So it's winter hardy, relatively low residue, but you do get nitrogen fixation, you do get good weed suppression. Some of the clovers like yellow sweet clover and like allset clover will provide some tillage for you as well. They've got some pretty good depth with their roots, but can be hard to terminate, especially in the spring. So just a consideration is leaving yourself ample time to really deal with that, that termination. The green there is, we've talked a lot about winter rye and vetch. Other options are wheat and triticale. They're a little less, wheat and triticale are nice because they are a little less heavy on the biomass. So if you get frustrated by rye because it goes bonkers on you, you might try wheat or triticale. I also know some people who mix oats with their winter rye. So they get a nice cover of weed suppression in the fall, but then the oats winter kill and you have a less dense stand in the spring. So it's a little easier to terminate. My only warning is if you go too heavy on the oats, they'll kind of form a mat and kill the stuff around it. And then the weeds can kind of come through those windows. So I'd go, maybe 20 pounds of oats and 80 pounds of rye or something like that for your ratio. But it does, there are options for minimizing your agony in the spring if rye is a bear for you. And then we haven't talked much, Laura touched on some of the mustards, but radish is, not always recommended for vegetable farms because of the brassica rotations, but it does provide this like very stinky, but very low residue, very weed-free area in the spring to plant right into. It's pretty cool. And same with field peas. You'll just have this kind of, I think of these as the like melting cover crops that just sort of turn to mush over the winter and there's nothing in the spring and you could go into it no-till. And then finally, you've got the high residue winter killed. So if you had a summer sorghum Sudan grass or Japanese millet cover crop, and you could mow it or you could just let it winter kill and you'll have a pretty mushy, gooey, high residue mat in the spring. Might be hard to deal with. You might need to mold board plow that. Oats, also, if you let them get really big, might be kind of gooey. But just, I think this is a neat way to frame some decision making. And back to this is pretty similar to Laura's point about biomass, but this is some research Heather Darby did right here in Vermont on winter rye and the biomass accumulation based on the date planted. So you can just see that the earlier you get it in, the more you're getting good cover and the more you're getting good biomass accumulation. So obviously you don't always have the opportunity to make these decisions, and you're, getting any cover on is better than nothing for just, preventing erosion, suppressing weeds, getting something in the spring growing. It's great. So if you're, harvesting carrots right up until the 1st of November and you toss on some winter rye, that's awesome. If you have bare ground now and you can get a cover crop on, if you have the time and resources, do it because you'll benefit so much more. It's more bang for the buck. And likewise, just thinking about what's going on underground, I can forget about this myself because I'm so focused on what I see. But the tillering with winter rye in particular is really important and is one of the big functions we get from it. So this again is based on the planting date. So the earlier you get it in, the more tillering you get. These later ones down in the lower right, that's a late fall planted rye, and you're really just not getting much of that tillering. So all the good stuff going on underground is limited. Seeding tools. This question comes up a lot. And I think if you're going to invest in one piece of equipment, I think a grain drill is a good one. Even this is a grain drill I used for years. You're always guaranteed to get stung by a wasp when you are using it, and It's a little bit of an arm breaker. You pull up and down on the gangs of the closing discs with that rope. You have to twist around and pull at it just the right time, about 6 feet before you're at the end of the field, and it takes a few rotations for it to actually come up, and sometimes it crashes down again. But it worked, and it's burying the seeds. It's giving good seed to soil contact. It's able to, you know, plant some relatively large seeds and get good establishment. The advantage of a grain drill is you are more guaranteed to have a good stand of cover crop, especially on sandy soil, and it's the density that you want. And you're using less seed, so it's usually about 20 to 30% less seed that you need for a grain drill. Disadvantage is it's a lot slower, and you know, obviously, like, it kind of an expense to get another piece of equipment that you have to maintain and all of that. Other options, you know, you can broadcast with your hand. I use the sling bag a lot. I think the bag is great for frost seeding or just running out to do some pathways or whatever. I recommend either walking on the seed or driving on it or doing something to really press it into the soil, even if the soil's moist, that you want some kind of contact taking place. Same with this flinger, you know, driving, you'll see better establishment in the wheel tracks if you're driving, broadcasting seed with a flinger, and that's very telling. So you need, you know, you really need to press it in somehow. And here's what we want to see afterwards, that little red winter rye germinating. You don't want to see all those weeds, but just ignore those. I like the cultipacker too for clovers, small seeded cover crops. Presses them in nicely. So sometimes, you know, if you have a grain drill, you might need to do 2 passes. If you have a small seed box on the grain drill, you can do both at once. But this is a good tool. And in a pinch, if this is the only tool you have, it'll work for pressing in big seeds as well. So again, this is establishing good seed to soil contact. And I know some farmers who, you know, use these for also forming their planting beds. They have a skinnier brilliant and can just even use it just to form a nice firm seed bed for salad mix and stuff too. No-till seeders are not that popular with vegetable farmers. They've been generally not scale appropriate built for bigger tractors and kind of priced out. They tend to be, you know, in the tens of thousands of dollars. But there's something we've been keeping our eye on. I think they're coming down in terms of price and opportunity. And this one in particular, the Hay Buster, is available for either free or for pretty inexpensive through a lot of the conservation districts in Vermont. So you can contact Laura or myself if you're interested in renting one. This is one that I had used out of the Middlebury office, and it was pretty awesome. This is a smaller one I rented from a dairy farmer. It's 6 feet wide. It was perfect for vegetable farming. It's heavy. It established a beautiful cover crop. And these I think are like $6,000 or $7,000. I'm not 100% on that, but expensive. It would be a lot to invest in a grain drill, but if you're going the no-till route, I think it's a pretty awesome tool. And this is just a quick video of back to that hay buster. You need a really big tractor to use it, but this is Spencer Blackwell going into a no-till area where he had oats, peas, and daikon radish growing, and we just went right in with some cover. I was done. Just quickly on the legumes, because this has been a passion and interest of mine, is better understanding how we can effectively use legumes for their nitrogen contribution in a cash crop system. So Laura talked a lot about the nodulation and how you want to inoculate, but here's some examples of nice, healthy, this hairy vetch is from a very mature vetch stand. And just some estimates that I've kind of worked with for contributions. Something I want to touch on is that the grasses here you see are contributing some nitrogen. That's that mopping up action that Laura alluded to. So if you put rye into a cash crop field that had some leftover nitrogen, it'll be mopping that up. It's not fixing it. There's no action happening in that way, but it is taking up whatever nitrogen was left over. So if you have a ton of nitrogen left, those can be like the best tools to use. I would skip a legume if you are suspecting that you have leftover nitrate in your field.
I'm actually going to jump off.
This conference will now be recorded.
So also here, something to pay attention to is that difference between the hairy vetch spring incorporation and the hairy vetch midsummer incorporation. That's what I was talking about in the earlier slides. Early in the spring, you're just not going to capture that nitrogen. So really thinking about letting it grow. Look at how much you can get if you wait until midsummer. It's at least 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre, which is 100% of your nitrogen needs for most crops. So just think about it. And lots of other awesome legumes you can play around with. Now, I also threw together some rough costs per pound, comparing it with fertilizer costs. And I tried to factor in driving time, person time, equipment costs, and seed costs for organic cover crop seed, just to show that it's roughly comparable to other organic sources of nitrogen. Obviously, these costs will vary widely, but I was just trying to put some comparison to it for how we consider the place of nitrogen from these cover crops. Now, the most important thing that we've been thinking about in our research is how that nitrogen released from those nitrogen fixer cover crops will match your cash crop needs, because you can release all the nitrogen you want from a cover crop. If it's not at the right time, and especially if you're on a soil that's sandy, you will still get leaching. Nitrate is the same nitrate as it is from fertilizer once it's been broken down into that form. So you really want to pay attention to the timing of all of this. And I know myself and other farmers, you will have a nice legume cover crop, you incorporate it, you're like, awesome, that looks so good. And then at the last minute, you're planting your crop, you're like, I don't know if I'm going to get any nitrogen. I'm just going to fertilize it anyway. Super common practice because we just don't know and we don't want to risk it. So here's your soil organic matter mineralization. Here's your cover crop mineralization. And then comparing that to fertilizer mineralization. And you can see that around 4 to 6 weeks is when those two things match up pretty well.
This conference will now be recorded.
And so I just wanted to show that we've been looking at a lot of these timings of nitrate releases after cover crop incorporation. And we have a lot of data on this, but this is just a quick snapshot of a couple of farms where we took pre-Cedars nitrate tests, which measures the available nitrate in the soil, and really just trying to understand when you should plant your cash crop after that cover crop incorporation. Everything we've been finding and other researchers have found suggests 4 to 6 weeks after cover crop incorporation is the best time to optimize that nitrate use. And obviously there's a lot of other factors at play there. We discussed earlier today some of the tillage, how that will matter, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, but probably most importantly is the weather. So if you've had a lot of rain or warm weather, that'll impact the nitrate in various directions. But just kind of rough rule of thumb is you want to wait 4 to 6 weeks for that maximum nitrate release. So if you're planting a transplant, you might plant it, 3 weeks after incorporation, and then your timing works out pretty well. So it roughly will match up with when your land is probably ready to be planted after the breakdown of the cover crop. But the take home is you can count on that nitrate, and you can use a pre-Cedars nitrate test to measure the available nitrate in the soil if you are concerned or curious, and feel free to reach out to me if you want more information on that. So finally, we're just posting some of these resources, which are favorites of ours. You probably are familiar with some of these, but some pretty awesome information, lots of inspiration on cover crops out there. And a list of seed sources in Vermont that we know about, or not only in Vermont, Lakeview's in New York, but they're really great to work with. And feel free to reach out to Laura or myself or Vern with any questions you might have. And here's our contact information. So thank you all so much, and look forward to hearing about everyone's cover cropping adventures. Send along pictures and questions, and thank you so much.